His 25 years in the Coast Guard taught him how to save lives. But was that what retirement taught him too? Thomas Harrison had been the keeper of Beacon Point Light for exactly 3 years and 8 months. Every morning at sunrise, he climbed the 127 steps to check the beacon. Every evening at sunset, he tested the fog signal. Between those duties, he maintained the grounds, repaired equipment, welcomed the occasional tourist who made the long drive to see Maine's most remote lighthouse. What visitors saw was a quiet man in his 60s living a peaceful retirement by the sea. What they didn't know was that beneath his lighthouse keeper's jacket was a man who had rescued over 400 people during his Coast Guard career. And on the night when Hurricane Elena brought chaos to the North Atlantic, that experience would save more lives than any mission he'd ever completed. Welcome to One Human One Story. Before we tell this incredible story, have you ever wondered about the lighthouse keeper watching over dangerous waters and what heroic experiences they might carry? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Thomas Harrison had joined the United States Coast Guard at 18 years old, fresh out of high school in Portland, Maine, looking for adventure and purpose. The recruiter had promised him both. 25 years later, when Chief Petty Officer Harrison retired, he had served on cutters from Alaska to Florida, rescued fishermen from sinking boats, pulled survivors from plane crashes, coordinated search and rescue operations that saved hundreds of lives. He had earned 3 Coast Guard Commendation Medals, 2 Meritorious Service Awards, and the respect of every sailor who had ever served under his command. But Thomas was tired. Tired of emergency calls at 3 in the morning. Tired of risking his life in storms that would terrify most people. Tired of saying goodbye to family for months at a time while his cutter patrolled distant waters. When the opportunity came to become keeper of Beacon Point Light, he didn't hesitate. Lighthouse keeping was a dying profession. Most beacons were now automated, but a few remote stations still required human caretakers. Thomas applied immediately. Beacon Point Light sat on a rocky promontory 30 miles northeast of Bar Harbor. Built in 1847, automated in 1983, returned to manned operation in 2019 when budget cuts eliminated the automated systems. The lighthouse served as both navigational aid and weather monitoring station. The keeper's duties included maintaining the beacon, recording meteorological data, providing radio communication for vessels in distress. It was perfect for someone who wanted to serve mariners without the physical demands of active duty. Thomas loved the solitude, the routine, the simple satisfaction of keeping the light burning every night. Beacon Point was home to only one other person, Mrs. Eleanor Mackenzie, 83 years old, widow of the lighthouse's previous keeper. She lived in a small cottage at the base of the point and helped Thomas with paperwork and radio communications. Eleanor had been around lighthouses her entire life. Her father had been a keeper. Her husband had been a keeper. She knew more about maritime safety than most Coast Guard officers. The lighthouse itself was a classic Maine design. White-painted stone tower rising 95 feet above the rocky shore. Keepers' quarters built into the base. Modern equipment housed in weatherproof buildings nearby. Radio antenna. Weather monitoring devices. Emergency generator. Everything needed to guide ships safely through some of the most dangerous waters on the East Coast. Thomas's daily routine was predictable and satisfying. Wake at 5:30 a.m., check overnight radio traffic, climb to the beacon room, inspect the light mechanism, record weather observations, update marine forecasts, monitor shipping traffic on radar, answer radio calls from vessels requesting navigation assistance, maintain buildings and equipment, Eleanor would arrive at 8 a.m. to help with administrative duties. They worked together until evening. Then Thomas would have dinner, read, sleep, repeat the cycle. It was exactly the peaceful retirement Thomas had hoped for, until September 15th, when Hurricane Elena changed everything. Elena had formed in the Atlantic 3 days earlier. Initially classified as a Category 2 storm moving northeast toward Nova Scotia, weather services predicted it would weaken before reaching Maine waters. But hurricanes are unpredictable. Elena intensified rapidly. By September 14th, it was a Category 4 storm with sustained winds exceeding 150 miles per hour. More troubling, the storm had changed course. Instead of continuing northeast, it was now tracking directly toward the Maine coast. Thomas spent September 14th monitoring weather reports and issuing marine warnings. Elena would make landfall somewhere between Portland and Bar Harbor. Beacon Point was directly in the storm's projected path. The National Weather Service recommended that all coastal residents evacuate immediately, but Thomas couldn't leave. The lighthouse was critical infrastructure. Ships would need guidance during the storm. Radio communication would be essential for rescue operations. Thomas and Eleanor decided to ride out Elena together. September 15th dawned gray and ominous. Wind was already gusting to 60 miles per hour. Waves were building to 20 feet. Eleanor moved from her cottage to the lighthouse keeper's quarters for safety. They secured all loose equipment, tested emergency systems, prepared for the worst hurricane to hit Maine in 30 years. At 2 p.m., Elena's outer bands reached Beacon Point. Wind speed jumped to 80 miles per hour. Rain fell horizontally. Visibility dropped to near zero. Thomas climbed to the beacon room to ensure the light was functioning properly. Ships would need all possible navigation aids during the storm. The beacon was designed to operate in severe weather, but Thomas wanted to monitor it personally. At 3:45 p.m., the first distress call came in. Coast Guard, Beacon Point. This is motor vessel Atlantic Star. We are taking on water. Position approximately 15 miles southeast of your location. Request immediate assistance. 47 souls on board. Thomas recognized the vessel. Atlantic Star was a passenger ferry that ran between Bar Harbor and the outer islands. During hurricane season, it should have been safely moored. But storms create emergencies. People get stranded. Boats get pressed into service for evacuations. The Atlantic Star was carrying people to safety when Elena caught them in open water. Thomas immediately contacted Coast Guard Station Southwest Harbor. Storm conditions prevented helicopter rescue. Surface vessels were unable to launch safely. The Atlantic Star was on its own in 100-mile-per-hour winds and 30-foot seas. Thomas coordinated with the ferry's captain, provided navigation guidance, helped calculate the safest route to shelter. At 4:20 p.m., a second emergency began. Beacon Point Light. This is cruise ship Northern Majesty. We have lost main power. Engines are offline. We are drifting toward shore. Estimate 1,800 passengers and crew aboard. Require immediate assistance. Thomas's blood went cold. The Northern Majesty was a large cruise ship that operated between Boston and the maritime provinces. 1,800 people. Dead in the water. Drifting toward one of the most dangerous coastlines in North America. Elena's winds were pushing the ship directly toward the rocky shores near Beacon Point. Thomas contacted Coast Guard District 1 headquarters. This was beyond his authority as a lighthouse keeper, but weather conditions made normal rescue operations impossible. No helicopters could fly, no rescue vessels could safely operate. The Northern Majesty was going to run aground unless someone took immediate action. Thomas made a decision that probably violated several federal regulations. He assumed operational command of the rescue effort. Using his lighthouse radio equipment, Thomas established communication with both distressed vessels. coordinated with Coast Guard units throughout Maine, contacted Canadian Maritime Rescue, organized every available resource for the largest rescue operation in Maine maritime history. The Atlantic Star was closer and had fewer people aboard. Thomas guided them to shelter first, used his knowledge of local waters to direct them to a protected cove behind Cranberry Island. 47 people reached safety at 5:15 p.m. One emergency resolved. The Northern Majesty was a much larger problem. 1,800 people on a ship without power drifting toward shore in hurricane conditions. Thomas calculated wind drift and current. Estimated the ship would run aground near Scudic Peninsula in approximately 2 hours. If the ship hit rocks at full speed in storm conditions, the death toll could be catastrophic. Thomas contacted the ship's captain directly. "Captain Anderson, I'm Chief Petty Officer Harrison, retired Coast Guard. I'm coordinating rescue operations from Beacon Point Light. We need to get power restored to your engines immediately. What's your status on backup systems?" Captain Anderson reported that the ship's main electrical systems had failed during the storm. Backup generators were functioning but couldn't power the propulsion system. The ship had emergency anchors, but they might not hold in storm conditions. 1,800 people were trapped on a floating building drifting toward destruction. Thomas thought like a Coast Guard rescue coordinator. What assets were available? What options existed? How could 1,800 people be evacuated from a disabled ship in hurricane conditions? The answer was both simple and terrifying. They couldn't be evacuated. The ship had to be saved. Thomas contacted every tugboat company from Bar Harbor to St. John. Most of their vessels were already in port riding out the storm. But Atlantic Maritime had one powerful ocean-going tug that might be able to reach the Northern Majesty. The tug Titan was moored in Eastport. Captain Robert McLeod was willing to attempt a rescue if weather conditions allowed. Thomas coordinated between the Northern Majesty and the Titan, provided navigation guidance through storm conditions, used Beacon Point's weather monitoring equipment to identify brief windows when rescue operations might be possible. At 6:30 p.m., the Titan departed Eastport. Estimated arrival at the Northern Majesty's position was 8:45 p.m. Meanwhile, Thomas worked with the cruise ship's crew to prepare for the towing operation. The ship's officers had to rig emergency towing gear in 100-mile-per-hour winds. Passengers were moved to interior cabins for safety. Emergency systems were activated to maintain life support if main power failed completely. Eleanor proved invaluable during the crisis. Her decades of Lighthouse experience included coordinating maritime emergencies. She maintained radio contact with Coast Guard stations, relayed weather updates, managed communication between multiple rescue vessels. Together, Thomas and Eleanor became the nerve center for the largest maritime rescue operation in Maine history. At 7:15 p.m., the Northern Majesty's situation became critical. The ship was now less than 5 miles from shore. Wind and current were pushing it toward the rocky coastline near Acadia National Park. If the Titan didn't arrive within the next hour, 1,800 people would be in mortal danger. Thomas made another decision that exceeded his authority. He activated Beacon Point's emergency beacon system. The Lighthouse beacon was designed to guide ships safely to harbor, but Thomas reconfigured it to serve as a warning signal. He aimed the beam directly at the Northern Majesty's position, created a visual reference point that could be seen through storm conditions, helped the cruise ship's crew maintain their position until the tug arrived. At 8:52 p.m., the Titan reached the Northern Majesty. Captain McLeod's crew managed to establish a towing connection despite hurricane conditions. It took 47 minutes to secure the tow line properly. During that time, the cruise ship drifted to within 2 miles of shore. Thomas provided constant navigation updates, helped coordinate the delicate operation of connecting 2 large vessels in storm conditions. The towing operation began at 9:39 p.m. The Titan's engines strained against hurricane winds and massive waves. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. But slowly, steadily, the Northern Majesty was pulled away from shore. By 11:15 p.m., the ship was in safe water. The immediate danger had passed. But the crisis wasn't over. The Northern Majesty needed to reach port for permanent repairs. The Titan didn't have enough fuel to tow the cruise ship all the way to Boston. Thomas coordinated with Canadian authorities. The ship could be taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Closer distance, sheltered harbor, better weather conditions on the Canadian side of the storm. The towing convoy reached Halifax at 6:30 a.m. on September 16th. Hurricane Elena had moved inland and was rapidly weakening. All 1,800 passengers and crew were safe. The Northern Majesty was secured in port for repairs. The Atlantic Star was sheltering safely behind Cranberry Island. Both rescue operations had succeeded. Thomas climbed to his lighthouse beacon room as the sun rose on September 16th. The storm had passed. The sea was calming. 2 ships and over 1,800 people were safe because an old lighthouse and an experienced Coast Guard veteran had been in the right place at the right time. The story made national news within hours. Retired Coast Guard Chief coordinates hurricane rescue from Lighthouse. Eleanor had documented the entire operation. Radio transcripts, weather logs, navigation records. The rescue would become a case study taught at Coast Guard training facilities. Thomas received dozens of interview requests. Television producers wanted to dramatize the story. Publishers offered book deals. Thomas declined them all. He had simply done what any Coast Guard veteran would do. Used his training and experience to help people in distress. The recognition was nice, but it wasn't why he had acted. The Coast Guard awarded Thomas the Coast Guard Distinguished Service Medal, the highest peacetime decoration for Coast Guard personnel. Eleanor received the Coast Guard Public Service Award for her role in the rescue. The ceremony was held at Beacon Point Light with the Lighthouse beacon serving as backdrop. But the most meaningful recognition came from the passengers themselves. Over the next 6 months, Thomas received hundreds of letters from people who had been aboard the Northern Majesty. Families thanking him for saving their children, elderly couples grateful for more years together, newlyweds who could now start their lives together. Each letter reminded Thomas why he had chosen to serve others. 6 months after Hurricane Elena, Thomas received a visit from Coast Guard Commandant Admiral Patricia Collins. She offered him a position as Emergency Response Coordinator for Coast Guard District 1. Use his experience and expertise to improve rescue operations throughout New England. Good pay, important work. Return to active duty in a meaningful role. Thomas considered the offer carefully. The work would be important. His experience would be valuable. But he had found peace at Beacon Point Light. The lighthouse needed a keeper. Mariners needed someone watching over dangerous waters. Thomas declined the position. Eleanor smiled when he told her. She had known he would stay. Thomas continued as keeper of Beacon Point Light. The routine returned to normal. Daily weather observations, equipment maintenance, radio communications with passing vessels. But now, everyone knew that the quiet lighthouse keeper was more than he appeared. When storms threatened shipping lanes, captains requested updates from Beacon Point. When young Coast Guard officers needed mentoring, they visited the lighthouse. Thomas had become an informal advisor to the entire maritime community. 2 years after Hurricane Elena, Thomas received word that the Lighthouse automation program was being reinstated. Budget cuts required eliminating manned lighthouse stations. Beacon Point Light would be converted to automatic operation. The lighthouse keeper position would be eliminated. Thomas wasn't surprised. Technology had been replacing lighthouse keepers for decades. Sally Snowman had been the last official Coast Guard lighthouse keeper when she retired from Boston Light in 2023. Thomas would be among the final generation of men and women to serve in this historic profession. But the Coast Guard made Thomas an unprecedented offer: stay at Beacon Point as a civilian caretaker, maintain the lighthouse grounds, serve as emergency coordinator for the region, keep the lighthouse heritage alive while adapting to modern requirements. Thomas accepted immediately. Elena passed away peacefully 3 months before the lighthouse conversion. She was 86 years old, had spent her entire life serving mariners. Thomas conducted her memorial service at the base of Beacon Point Light. Coast Guard cutters and civilian vessels gathered offshore to honor a woman who had dedicated her life to maritime safety. Thomas continued alone at Beacon Point. The lighthouse beacon was now computer-controlled. Weather monitoring was automated. Radio communications were handled by satellite systems. But storms still threatened shipping. Emergencies still required human judgment and experience. Thomas remained ready to serve when needed. On quiet evenings, Thomas would climb to the beacon room and watch the light sweep across dark waters. Ships passed safely, guided by technology his predecessors could never have imagined. But the mission remained the same: watch over dangerous waters, guide mariners to safety, be ready when someone needs help. Thomas Harrison had served his country for 25 years, had saved hundreds of lives during his Coast Guard career, had coordinated the largest maritime rescue in Maine history during his retirement. But his greatest accomplishment wasn't any single rescue operation. It was a lifetime of service, a commitment to protecting others that never ended even when the uniform came off. Some people retire from service, others just change their watch station. Thomas had traded his Coast Guard cutter for a lighthouse tower, exchanged ship radar for weather monitoring equipment. But the mission remained the same: protect mariners, save lives, serve something greater than himself. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark Atlantic every night, a beacon of hope for ships in dangerous waters, a symbol of safety maintained by someone who understood that retirement isn't the end of service. It's just the beginning of a different kind of watch, a quieter mission, a more personal commitment to protecting the people who trust you to keep the light burning. So I ask you, have you ever met someone whose quiet dedication made dangerous places safer? Someone whose lifetime of service continued long after their official duties ended? Someone who understood that heroism isn't about recognition, but about being ready when others need you most? Tell us about the guardians in your community, because here at One Human, One Story, we believe that real heroes never retire. They just find new ways to serve. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that service comes in many forms and dedication has no expiration date. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who spend their lives protecting others. And remember to thank the quiet professionals who watch over dangerous places. You never know when their vigilance might save your life. Sometimes the most important lights aren't in cities or stadiums. Sometimes they're on remote cliffs, where retired heroes keep watch over troubled waters. Sometimes the greatest rescues happen not during active duty, but during retirement, when experience meets opportunity, and a lifetime of training saves hundreds of lives. And sometimes the most meaningful service is the kind that continues long after the ceremony ends and the uniform comes off, but the commitment remains forever.